Welcome to the Page Turn podcast. I'm your host, Tori Sharp, a children's graphic novelist and literary agent.
And I'm Sydney Dean, a comics-curious illustrator for clients like Dropout TV's Dimension 20.
We're bringing you into the conversations we wish we'd had before breaking into comics, so that you'll know what to expect when taking your story from script to shelf. Host Introduction 1, Interview with Sydney Dean. What to do when you're a fandom artist whose wizard school fandom suddenly leaves a bad taste in your mouth, and how to persevere in publishing when your first journey into it doesn't go as planned. Sydney, I really wanted you to host this podcast with me because you bring an unusual perspective of comics and publishing to our interviews. And I want to get to all of that. But first, I'd really like to ask you, what are your very first memories of drawing?
Oh boy. When I think back about me drawing as a kid, it was often in places where I felt really uncomfortable. I remember going to restaurants and feeling like it was all too loud and like overwhelming. And my mom would always carry crayons so that I could color. And then things got quieter in my head and in the world. After school, it was the first thing I wanted to do was like color on the floor. I often skipped recess and asked if I could just stay inside and keep working on whatever art project I was working on. I just always felt like what I wanted to be doing or was supposed to be doing.
Were you the kind of kid who would be like drawing in class during lessons?
Yeah, all the time. Constantly. My kindergarten teacher like deeply disliked me. I gave her so much trouble. We would have like 30 minutes of drawing time before we were supposed to go to lunch and recess. And I was like, no, my drawing's not done yet. Like, I can't go. So that was sort of the vibe I brought to the kindergarten classroom.
Sydney Dean cannot be stopped. So now a lot of the art that you do is of lush, beautiful settings and characters. Some of them are original characters, some of them are fan art. Did you start with fan art, or did you start with your own original stories or something else?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I think when I started like with the intent of studying art or getting better at art, I did a lot of like mindless exercises that didn't have anything to do with like character or story. I just wanted to make like an eye that looked really good. And that was a lot of my sketchbooks when I was younger. And then I sort of transitioned into writing my own stories, maybe in like, I don't know, 6th grade, 7th grade, but I would never share them with anyone. I was like deeply embarrassed of like whatever I was writing. I also became a dedicated 2012 Tumblr girly. So fan art like overtook my body and soul for a good portion of my teen years. I really liked being able to draw things that brought me closer to a community. So being able to sort of contribute to this space of nerds who really cared about something and then, you know, got me through some of like the absolutely mind-numbing years of being like 14, 15. I loved the idea of giving back or being a part of the circulation of creations that were happening. I just wanted to be a part of something. And so fan art became my main outlet for a while.
That's so interesting because when you describe writing stories when you were in 6th grade or so, you said you didn't want to share them, and suddenly you're a Tumblr girly and you're letting anyone on the internet see these things that you were creating. What was it about it that made you feel safe sharing your work for the first time?
Well, I think there was sort of a classic anonymity to Tumblr. There was
Mm.
like a running joke about like, I hope my mom or my best friend never finds my blog name. We were all strangers in a sense who just bonded over common interests, but knew nothing about each other's personal lives. And so it felt like a really safe space to share stuff without judgment or without preconceived ideas about who you were or who you were supposed to be.
It changed eventually, right? Because now you use your own name and your, mom could definitely find it if she wanted to. So I'm so curious to hear even how that happened. Like, what's your first memory then of being willing to share your art and stories in a public sense as yourself?
I think I had joined this Facebook group where obviously you have to use your name. And it was to discuss the fan fiction we were reading. And I was probably 17 or 18 when I joined. And me and my best friend in high school were reading so much fan fiction. I had posted some fan art in that group, I think because I saw them all becoming like close friends and like flying out to meet each other. And I was like craving that sort of closer community outside of the anonymity. Um, and so I just did it. And everyone was so kind. I mean, there's no place less judgmental than a fan fiction Facebook group. So it just felt super safe. And also, I had graduated high school, right? So, like, those ideas of my persona or who I wanted to be seen as, I just sort of stopped worrying about kids in my chemistry class finding my art because it felt like I was never going to see them again.
You have managed to make a career out of essentially drawing fan art, working for some of these properties like Dimension 20 that you adore outside of the work you do, and you get to draw these characters and stories as part of your freelance career. What was next for you? What was the next step?
I started selling commissions and then doing conventions. So that was sort of stepping into the real life space of selling art. And a lot of it was Harry Potter based for like my first 2 years. I moved to LA and started taking like my art super seriously because I wanted to be able to sustain myself off of it. That was my first time like living out of the house. And I don't know, I felt like I had something to prove. And so I just worked super hard and made so much art in that year. And I traveled around to different conventions and I met so many like kind people and encouraging people. And I was able to like make a living full time in 2019 off of like basically Harry Potter fan art, which like morally isn't great looking back. And also, you know, in 2020, J.K. Rowling's transphobic views were so clear. And I needed to leave that behind for like my own mental health, but also it just didn't feel good or right to keep creating in that space. So I sort of was making fan art full time, launched a Patreon based off of it, and then had to do a hard pivot to my own characters.
Oh, so switching from, or I guess beginning to explore your own characters at that point in your life, it sounds like it was a bit reactionary to this fan culture that you loved being unfortunately tainted by the views of the creator and giving you an opportunity to step back and say that you didn't stand for the transphobia in the community. Is that right? Is that like a big part of why you pivoted to original stories?
Yeah, it felt like a sink or swim kind of moment where I was always really scared of doing original characters or original stories, like back to that like seventh grade fear of like, this is so vulnerable and everyone's going to judge me and they're going to assume things about me. And what if they don't like it? All sorts of fears came up when I thought about making original art.
Why is it so much different than fan fiction or fan art?
I don't know. I think because it's a reflection of you, maybe more so a reflection of you. I always just felt like there were going to be eyes on me. And again, I was thinking about people in my life that I wasn't in contact with anymore, maybe reading into certain choices, or it's that classic, like, assuming people are thinking about you when they aren't. And
Mm.
like that skewed point of view. I think it probably also had a lot to do with like queerness and coming out. And a lot of the characters I had in my head were processing a lot of liking women um, and putting that into a story. Just, it felt so vulnerable.
Once you did it feel as scary and bad as you expected before you did it?
No, it didn't. Well, I also think I really eased into it. Like, I was just posting sort of illustrations with these characters. I wasn't posting comics or stories. It was just little snapshots of moments. And sometimes I would write more about them and put that on my Patreon, and that would almost always give me some sort of like vulnerability hangover. But actually posting the art and sharing it was received really generously by people. And I think it would be nice if I could come to a conclusion about like posting original art and being vulnerable without that sort of validation. But the validation really helped.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know you're putting it in front of people. It's very scary when you share something that means a lot to you and there's silence, and it makes sense to worry about that response or to be encouraged by getting the opposite response. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit because I jumped forward because I was excited to hear about your original characters. But we started with being younger, drawing to reduce overwhelm, wanting to make your own stories, turning to fan art. Did you go to art school?
I did not. Since I figured out that art was a job you could do, was telling people that that was what I was going to do. So I always assumed that I would go to art school because that just seemed like the path. I was also like a very scholarly kid. I took school really seriously. I always pictured myself going to college. But when it came down to it, it was not in the cards without a whole lot of debt. And that was a really scary way to enter adulthood. So I started researching alternatives, and I had this podcast that I loved called The Artcast with Chris Oatley. And I remembered that he offered some online classes. I looked up some videos of him teaching, and I was like, I'll try this. Like, this would be cool. I don't know if I'll get in to any of these courses because I'm 17 and haven't learned Photoshop yet, but we'll see. And I ended up taking a few mentorships with Oatley Academy. That's how I learned pretty much all of my art and storytelling fundamentals.
I love that you found it right at that juncture. You said you were 17, so you're right at the end of high school, realizing that art college isn't in the cards. And at that time in our lives, we were just starting to see these online resources like Oatley Academy, which is now called the Magic Box Academy, and things like Skillshare, sites that artists could use to cobble together their own education without going into mountains of debt. And also, a lot of these are accessible in cultures outside of the US. I know that Magic Box Academy in particular has students all over the world. And that's also how we met. We both took a mentorship together through one of those programs almost 7, 8 years ago now.
Yeah.
So you are finding your own education. And what sort of things were you learning that helped you become a better storyteller through these alternative education methods, podcasts, online classes?
I think my main takeaway from those mentorships was about how, like, the class that we met in was called Painting Drama. And I think the idea that every choice that you make in a composition and an illustration can push forward whatever story, whatever narrative, whatever emotion you're trying to portray and pull out of the viewer. Something as simple as whether the path that the eyes led on when an audience member is looking at a painting can sort of decide the narrative of that piece. My mind was blown by that. And I think it got me really interested in illustration and trying to tell a story with one image, with one snapshot.
I definitely found that fascinating too. And I did go to art school. And right at the start of art school, I found those same podcasts you were talking about. I was learning so many things about the lifestyle of being an artist, like the business side of it, but also the emotional side of just carrying on, and about things like what you were describing with the story of a single piece that I wasn't getting in art school. And some of those things ended up being the most important lessons I learned in my education leading up to breaking into comics, despite having some really excellent teachers and learning a lot in art school. I don't feel like my education would have been complete without those lessons that you were just describing too. And I just think it's magical that you found it, that you stumbled across it.
Yeah, it felt serendipitous for sure. I don't know what I would have done because it also created some sort of community. Like we had a Facebook group, and it's how I learned how to give honest critique and take critique and things that people say make art school worth it. Like when they list off, like, oh, maybe I didn't learn like the skills that I use in my art career, but I did like make a lot of friends, or I got better at taking critique. Like I got all of that in our courses at Oatley Academy or Magic Box, which is really cool. It was a very valuable thing that I'm really glad I found.
So, how did you go from these mentorship to breaking in a broader sense? What was the first moment that you felt like you had broken into either illustration or comics? Because I'm not sure which actually came first for you.
That's a great question. I feel like I've had so many moments, so many different moments of feeling like, oh man, I made it. Like the first one was when I was able to pay rent in LA with the art that I had made, and that was all through commissions and selling fan art, and that was huge. I started getting external validation from clients or literary agents. There was a moment when I had pivoted to making my own characters and was posting illustrations about them, and I was reached out to by a literary agent who was interested in developing a graphic novel with me about those characters. That really felt like a moment of making it, especially with the reactions of the people around me. Like, I didn't know that much about publishing or making a graphic novel, but I was in a mentorship at the time, and my classmates were like so excited for me. And that felt good. And I definitely rode that excitement.
So, you were posting about these original characters, which got the attention, it sounds like, of this literary agent. What form of story were you planning to tell with those characters? Were you already thinking maybe you would make them into a graphic novel, even though you didn't know a whole lot about the industry yet? Or did you have some other plan for how to tell those character stories?
I was thinking maybe a web comic. I thought I'm such a nerd and I love stories so much. It felt like they were the right characters to try and form a full story with. And graphic novels felt like the right medium for me. But like I had that idea in my head. I had not done anything to execute besides just drawing these characters over and over and sort of writing down little scenes or storylines that popped into my head.
Yeah, wow. No wonder people in that class were having such a reaction because trying to get a literary agent is something people do for years and years. I think I was actively querying for 5 to 7 years before I signed with my own literary agent. So it's just very glamorous outwardly to be approached by one. What was that like when this agent approached you? How did you feel about it? And also, what was sort of the plan presented to you by them about what to do with this story?
Yeah, I was flattered and excited, and there, were all sorts of industry terms being used about how my concept for these characters was on trend, and it was very like cozy fantasy based. It was about witches who run a bakery. It was presented to me as, okay, sign with me and then we will build a pitch and then we will submit that pitch. And I was like, okay, I'm going to need a lot of help, but I'm on board because this is what I was saying I was going to do. So I might as well do it with someone who knows more than me about the industry and can help me learn what a pitch is.
Yeah, that's definitely not unheard of, especially with graphic novels and other illustrated works. Agents can tend to be scouting, to be looking at people's Instagrams, finding their websites, and then reaching out to see if they have any interest in trying to make a book. You presented it as this three-step process of sign with them, build a pitch, submit the pitch. Was it that simple when you did it?
Yep. No.
Oh.
No. I mean, I guess technically, like that is what happened. I just think I got really overwhelmed really quickly, realizing how much work goes into making a comic because I had never done even 1% of that. Like I had never learned how to tell a story sequentially. I wasn't even really reading comics or graphic novels back when this happened. I just felt like I had so much to learn and I was starting from like -5 when it came to knowledge. And so I got sort of in my head and it didn't feel fun because I felt all of this
Mm.
pressure all of a sudden to make something really good really fast to submit.
Do you think that pressure was self-imposed?
I think it was a little bit of both. I think that agents make more money the quicker that they sell projects. And that's just maybe
Mm.
a fact of the career. So there was a pressure to do it fast because it was a trendy idea. And I think my agent had already started soft pitching to people who were really excited to see some
Mm.
stuff.
Mhm.
So I think I was getting pressure from that agent and the idea of this being hot in the industry right now. Also, yeah, self-imposed for sure. I think that's just kind of an aspect of my personality where I want to do a really good job. And so doing something new is really terrifying because I'm probably not going to do a perfect job the first time. And I hate that.
I think even like the 100th or the 1000th time you make a comic, it's still really scary because it uses so many skills at once. And you were really thrown into the deep end, not as a, slight against that agent or something. This is totally normal to pick up illustrators and see if they feel suited for drawing a graphic novel. A lot of agents also have never made a comic. Like they might not be fully aware of how many different skills go into sequential storytelling, and that you can have somebody with a lot of like storytelling chops in a general sense or storytelling in a single illustration like you were talking about before, but then being able to translate those skills to the medium of comics is like learning an entirely different language. So I think it makes total sense that it would have felt overwhelming. But what happened next? Did you ever get that pitch out on submission?
I think it was about 6 months, no, maybe 9 months after I signed with that agent, we were on sub. I so vividly remember sending the email with the final pitch packet that I had edited a million times, trying to get it to a place where I was happy with it, and just praying that no one was going to pick it up because
Wow.
I just had kind of a miserable time making it. And the idea of doing it for, 200, 250 pages was unthinkable to me.
What was hard about it, about making it?
I think everything is hard about making comics. Or it just, like you said, it felt like I was trying to speak in a language that I hadn't learned yet. So It was like every choice took effort.
Nothing was instinctive yet.
No, yeah, that's a really good way to put it. And I felt very separated from whatever those instincts were when I was first making these characters and thinking of these stories. Like the original concept that I had come up with was so different from what we submitted.
Oh.
Yeah. It was hard to know whether or not that was normal. I didn't know anything, and I felt so separated from what was fun about creating because I felt like I had different voices, one of which was my own, saying that I wasn't very good at this or I needed to be faster if I was going to make this work as a career or for the length of a book. I just didn't feel any confidence by the time we submitted that I could do it.
So it wasn't just then that you were nervous about doing the work though, right? Like it wasn't just that you realized there was this maybe skill gap or that you wanted to get better at comics before signing on to do a whole book of them, but also that you weren't feeling as connected to the story anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah. Storytelling, like I said, was not something I was doing since I was a kid or was doing actively. I love stories deeply and I love dissecting them or complaining about them or trying to like figure out what would make them better. But I had never written a first, second, and third act before.
Practice that in our mentorship, but in such a condensed way.
Mhm.
I remember learning story spine, which they use at like Pixar, and some other principles of the three acts. But there's a difference between learning it in a theoretical way and writing a long form story, right?
I think so. I also had it in my brain that like some people have it, like can do it,
Oh,
like are innately born with that skill and it's rare for you to have that skill. Like I just again, it felt like there was such a gap. I don't feel like I had confidence that I could do it when I was actively doing it. I don't know that I believed that it was going to be good.
isn't it strange how there are some skills like that? Like people think that if you don't know how to sing, you can't learn how to sing
Mhm.
because some people can sing and some can't. And if you don't know how to write, you can't learn how to write. Some people are just innately good at it, which I like to press against. Like, I think part of the problem there isn't that we are just born good or bad at it. I think that the way people teach to sing and teach to write are done in such a narrow way that you can't use the breadth of different skills that people can bring to it.
I agree 100%. I mean, that's something I say about art all the time too. Both of us probably get all the time like, "Oh, I can't even draw a stick figure." And it's like,
That is always the default
I
thing people
know.
say. It always makes me laugh.
I know. I probably if I had a nickel, I would have a
Yeah.
billion nickels.
Way more than two
So
nickels.
many
Yeah.
more than two. And I also push against that because I loved drawing when I was a kid. It felt safe and comfortable. I was not better at coloring with crayons than the other 5 year olds, in my
Mhm.
personal opinion. I think it was something that I just kept doing. It's all like
Yeah.
I fully believe it all comes down to practice. And maybe we're innately drawn to different things when we're younger and so we get a head start. But I am, I think, on my way to unlearning that belief that storytelling is like this far away magical skill that only some people have. And I think actually Dungeons and Dragons has helped me a lot with that.
Wow.
Just being able to play with your friends and realize how innate storytelling is to us as human beings was so healing when I got into playing D&D more the past couple of years. When I got into a campaign with you where we were playing every week earlier this year, it was the first time I had started thinking about writing characters again because storytelling felt playful. It didn't feel like all of this pressure was riding on it, and that was really cool.
I love that. Yeah. I think storytelling is one of the most fundamental human skills. It's a big part of how we share information with each other just day to day. And again, that's different than long form stories with structures. It gets more and more complex the more moving pieces you add to the kind of story you're trying to tell. But I fully think everybody's capable of it. And I'm glad that you're getting to the point where you're starting to be able to believe that maybe that's true too. Can you walk me through what happened next after going on submission? Did it ever sell?
It did not. It didn't sell, and I parted with that agent a little bit after that. I ended up getting more freelance illustration opportunities that were paying the bills. I started working with Dimension 20. I think just being in the publishing space didn't feel like the right place for me back then. And so I started doing some full-time illustration work. I made a calendar that's in the D20 merch store. Like you said, basically making fan art for a living, which is the dream.
Yeah. Got back to your first love.
Back to the roots.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So heckin' cool. There's one more connection I want you to make for me in the time that we have left. You had an agent. The process of trying to make a graphic novel, pitch and publish it left a very bad taste in your mouth. You felt very discouraged and like you couldn't do it. Have slowly been unlearning that. But even before D&D, even before we got into that together, I approached you and I said, Sydney, I want you to co-host this podcast about children's graphic novel publishing. And you said, absolutely, that's exactly what I want to do. So what happened to make you start being curious about comics again and considering publishing again?
A lot of it was distance and getting older. I feel like I have more armor and I'm
Hmm.
less scared of writing those stories and putting them out there again. I just can't let go of the idea that I could make a story. I think since the first one didn't go maybe the way that I wanted, I almost feel like it's unfinished business. And I want to rewrite that ending and make a story in a way that feels joyful and creatively invigorating and contribute some queer representation to the YA space. Like, there's a lot about it
Yeah.
that I feel really drawn to and that I can't shake. So I think the idea of doing this podcast and getting to hear the different stories from artists and writers who have gone through the process of publishing books would be healing and kind of motivating.
Part of why I wanted to invite you to co-host is because you're essentially the target audience with a little bit more of an insight into the actual process of getting an agent, pitching, publishing, all of that. I hadn't known actually at the time when I asked you that you parted ways with your agent, but I had known that you had signed on with one at one point and that you had pitched a comic and been interested in comics. So I'm very excited to have you on, and you can be our test subject of whether the Page Turn podcast is actually going to motivate people who are early career comic artists who want to make their own book or are perhaps working on their first graphic novel. We'll see if it can inspire you to tell the stories that, like you're saying, I think the world needs.
I mean, this first one was just about me, but so far I'm feeling great about it. 10 out of 10.
Oh my gosh, is it working
Yeah,
already?
it's working.
All right. I'm feeling inspired too. I love hearing different ways that people approach art and their careers, and that you can also switch it up. I bet that even once you are making graphic novels, you're still going to be making really cool fan art that you get paid a lot to do by the people who made the characters. Seems likely to me.
Oh, that's so nice to hear. Ideal scenario.
Thank you so much for coming on and doing an interview today so that we can get to know you. Is there anything else you want to say before we sign off?
I love lady nights, and I'm so excited to make this podcast with you.
The lady night thing, is so out of context, and I love that for our listeners. I too love lady nights. You should know if you're listening to this podcast, it is hosted by two queer people who are obsessed with lady nights.
Yeah, I needed to come up.
Thank you for listening to the Page Turn podcast. Your hosts are Tori Sharp and Sydney Dean. You can find out more about this podcast and our guests in the show notes or at torysharp.com/podcast. The theme music is Would You Please Wake Up by Patricia Taxon.
Would you please wake up, my dearest love? No one has told me that I'll be okay yet today. No one has called me a beautiful girl yet today.